Chapter 44. Michael was silent as he mulled over the story that Sarah and Josh had just finished telling him. They were sitting in the basement, the two of them on the couch and him in the chair. Mira was sitting back on its haunches. Mira was sitting back on its haunches between the two teenagers. He watched them closely as he ran back through all the details in his head. When they described the little girl they had encountered at Ambrose Lake, he had retrieved the case file Maggie had left with him days earlier and shown them the pictures of the missing children. They had confirmed that the girl they had seen was one of them, a 6-year-old named Blake Paulson. Things were starting to come together in his head. Josh had mentioned the old story about the Well Witch, and that fit in his own hypothesis about the demons that had been brought into Lamplight Woods. Between Mr. Skitter, Skinrot, and the Well Witch, that meant that all 3 missing children were accounted for. There was a lot more to the puzzle, but at least some of the pieces were falling into place. In the meantime, though, he had 2 teenagers to deal with. He was conflicted about what to do. Sarah had lied to him, and worse, told an outsider about a number of things that he wasn't happy about having been revealed. On the other hand, she had been responsible enough to come to him and tell him what had happened, even though she knew that she would get into trouble. He stood up and walked around the small table that separated the chair and couch. He took Sarah's hand and pulled her up to her feet. She looked both surprised and confused. Before she could say anything, he wrapped his arms around her in a tight hug. The part of her story that kept playing over and over again in his mind was that he'd almost lost her multiple times during their escape from the lake. The thought of that was terrifying, and everything else was unimportant compared to that. After a moment, she returned the hug and started to cry into his shoulder. He felt the stress in her body loosen as she did so. She was a tough kid, but what she had gone through had been horrible. She couldn't just keep it balled up inside of her. When her sobs started to subside, he kissed her on the top of the head and pulled back slightly. "So I'm guessing that I'm not going to be getting my old bike back?" he said with mock seriousness. She laughed and pushed away from him, playfully punching him in the arm. She wiped away the tears and sniffed loudly. She seemed embarrassed by the show of emotion. "I promise that I'm not usually like this," she said to Josh. "It's okay," the boy assured her. "You lasted longer than I did. I was a mess when I got home." "Now then," Michael interjected firmly. "This is the part where you both need to make me a promise." They stopped talking and waited for him to continue. "You seem like a good guy, Josh," he continued. "I probably don't need to say this, but I'm going to anyway. Sarah's told you some things about both our family and Lamplight Woods as a whole that need to stay quiet. You can't tell anyone about any of it." "Oh, of course, Mr. Dyer," Josh said quickly. "I hadn't planned to." "Good. Thank you. Sarah, I need you to look me in the eyes and promise me that this is the last time that you reveal family secrets without talking to me first about it. Like I said, Josh seems fine, but you have told him some things tonight that weren't your things to share." She opened her mouth to protest, but she seemed to think better of it. He could tell that what he had said had resonated with her. She nodded in agreement. An hour later, after they'd all talked about less serious subjects for a while, Josh headed back home. Sarah walked him out to his car and spoke privately with him for a few minutes. Michael resisted the urge to watch them from the window. She came back through the front door and turned around to wave goodbye to her friend. She closed the door behind her and faced her father with a slightly worried look on her face. "Dad, I really am sorry that I didn't tell you about what happened earlier," she said. I wasn't ready to talk about it, or even to understand what had happened. I thought having Josh here would help me explain things." "You eventually did tell me," Michael pointed out. "That does count for something." "So, what now?" He thought about the question for a moment. "I'm not really sure. I do think that you should stay at Forgotten Tales for the foreseeable future." She stood up straight. "You're grounding me?" He shook his head. "No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's clearly not safe out there right now. If If you stay here until we know it is... Come on, Dad. When is it ever going to be absolutely safe? You know what I mean. Yeah, I do, and I get that you're trying to protect me, but come on. Putting me under house arrest isn't the way to do it. He shook his head in frustration. It's not house arrest. Are you forgetting that you were attacked this afternoon? Her face started to turn red. No, I absolutely have not. I'm also not forgetting that we weren't attacked until there was no one else around, and even when everything went down, we did a pretty damn good job of handling ourselves. And if you don't the next time, he said quickly. What if the next time you don't manage to get lucky like you did 1,000 different times today? What then? They stared at each other for a few tense minutes. He didn't think that he was being unreasonable in the slightest. He was keeping her safe, which was his job as a parent. Look, is there a compromise here? Sarah asked finally, visibly forcing herself to calm down. What kind of compromise? He responded suspiciously. For as long as she had been alive, Sarah had been a negotiator. When she was 4, they had had a long conversation about her bedtime and how she believed that adding an additional hour to the time she was awake was a good idea. A few years later, she had offered a very well thought out argument for why she shouldn't have to go to school even though she wasn't sick, because other kids might be and could thus pass germs on to her. His personal favorite had been on her 13th birthday. She had actually presented scientific studies about how the removal of her curfew would be good for her development. What if I promised to only leave the property if you or Josh are with me? Sarah asked. At least until whatever this is has passed. That way I'm never alone. That should be safe. Not good enough, Michael said flatly. Her eyes narrowed. Fine. What if I also promise to only go out during the day? Keep going. She closed her eyes and shook her head in frustration. How about I also promise to only go over to Josh's house and to places where there are a lot of other people around? Despite knowing that she was attempting to manipulate him, he considered her proposal. Sarah chafed under too many rules and restrictions. The more that got put on her, the more likely she was to purposely disobey them. Her suggestions were all reasonable, and she had been right about one thing. There was no way to make sure that she was perfectly safe all the time. Okay, he relented. As long as you're willing to work within those limitations, I guess I'm fine with it. Thank you, Dad, Sarah said with a sigh of relief. Yeah, well, don't make me regret it. Why don't you head up to bed? We could both use some rest. That's the best idea I've heard all day. She walked past him and towards the stairs. He shook his head slowly. She had worn him down, and it hadn't even taken very long. She was definitely her mother's daughter. He turned away from the stairs. While he was feeling tired, he had something else that he needed to do first. There was still the matter of making sure that Mr. Skidder wouldn't be coming after Maggie. He unlocked the hidden study and shut himself inside. Chapter 45. Michael didn't get much sleep that night. He knew that he needed to, but the work was important. He spent the majority of the time in the study referencing texts and making notes on a blackboard. Every so often he would doze off on one of the chairs, but it was never for more than a few minutes at a time. It was almost 7 when his phone rang. He looked up at the screen and saw that it was Maggie. He wasn't the only one that hadn't gotten much sleep. Good morning, he answered. I'm surprised that you're awake already, Maggie replied, her voice sounding exhausted. I think it's more accurate to say that I'm still awake. You were supposed to get some rest. I know, but I was working on something. Listen, I have good news. From what I've been reading, the demon... Yeah, I know. It can be hard to sleep when you're all wound up. Confused, Michael stopped talking. It's good to know that you're feeling better, Maggie continued. So, hey, I'm here with Mayor Dilfer in her office. She's asking if there's anything that we need to wrap up this case as soon as possible. I'm not sure, he said slowly, catching on as to why she had interrupted him. Maybe you and I can sit down and come up with a list. Good idea. I'll pass that along. Jenny made some breakfast for you and Sarah. Would we be able to drop that and your car off at your place? Say, in an hour or so? That would be fine. Maggie hung up, and Michael was left staring at the screen of his phone. He wasn't fully sure of what had been going on with that conversation, but the final part had been clear enough. She was going to come by in an hour so that they could speak freely. By the time that he got into the shower and got dressed, Sarah had woken up. He was both glad and jealous that she looked like she wasn't suffering any physical effects from the previous day. He didn't want his daughter to suffer, of course, but it hardly seemed fair that she had gone through a more strenuous ordeal than he had, and yet he was the one worse for the wear. "Father?" she said as she filled a bowl with cereal. "Daughter?" he replied. "Sleep well?" "Better than you, apparently. You look like you got run over by a truck." "Truth be told, it feels like the truck went over me, then backed up for another pass. Sheriff Grant is going to be here in a few minutes." "No problem. I'm just going to eat breakfast and get ready to leave." He raised an eyebrow. "I thought that maybe you would want to hang out here today after everything that happened yesterday. Get some rest, recharge, that sort of thing." "Nah, Josh is going to pick me up and we're going to hang out at his house." She smiled at him. "Don't worry, Dad. I plan on following our agreement to the letter." "Yeah, well, I have to be honest. I'm not sure if I'm more worried about you being attacked by a monster or you going over to a hormonally crazed teenage boy's house." Sarah's face contorted. "Ew, Dad, nothing like that is going to happen. It's not like that. I'm just saying, if you come home pregnant—" "Jesus Christ," she said angrily, putting her bowl in the sink and storming upstairs. Michael managed to make it a few seconds before the grin spread across his face. He knew it had been mean, but he couldn't help himself. There was a knock on the front door. He went out into the shop and glanced out the window. Maggie was standing on the porch, still wearing the same uniform she had been the previous evening. There were large bags under her eyes. He quickly let her in, noticing that his car was back in the driveway as he did so. "What a fucking night," she said by way of greeting, running a hand over her face. "That seems to be the general consensus," Michael commented. "You want something to drink?" "Yeah, a stiff shot of whiskey, and leave the bottle. I can offer you a can of Coke in a mostly clean glass." "That will have to do." They went into the kitchen, and he retrieved the can from the refrigerator. Maggie waved off the glass and proceeded to drink the entirety of the can's contents in one long guzzle. She set it down on the counter and nodded gratefully. "Sorry about that weird call earlier," she said. "I couldn't say much in front of Dilfer." "So what's going on?" he asked. "We're on our own, that's what's going on." She shook her head in frustration. "I told Dilfer that we need help. There are demons running around out there. We had a shooting right in the middle of downtown, and Grace Clarendon was murdered yesterday. Things are spiraling out of control. We need help from the state, maybe even the feds. Do you know what she said?" "Lamplight Woods handles Lamplight Woods business." Maggie looked at him closely. She seemed thrown by what he had said. Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know that's what she said?" Maggie asked, the tone of her voice cold and unfriendly. "Because that's been the response to every request for outside help with paranormal activity since before I was born," Michael explained. "Both my father and grandfather were adamant about it, as well as every authority figure in Lamplight Woods that I've ever known." "Why? Explain to me why we can't get any fucking help when we need it this badly." "I'm not saying I agree with it," he said quickly. "There were decisions made a long time ago that people still insist on sticking to now. There's nothing that we can do about it. If we try to contact someone and explain what's going on, we'll be dismissed as lunatics. Without the support and weight of the mayor's office, we can't get anywhere with outside requests." Maggie swore loudly. "This is insane, Michael." "Again, I'm not disagreeing with you. It is. There isn't time to figure out a way around it, though. We're just going to have to work out how to deal with things ourselves. What was that part of the call where you asked if we needed anything about—" She regained control of her temper with visible effort. Even though she rejected my request to call in outside authorities, she did say that she would try to get us anything that we might need, as long as it won't raise any suspicions anyway. She made me call you right then and there. It's probably her way of sending a message. Michael nodded. Makes sense. She wants to keep things in-house, so she's willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that happens. This is so stupid. Yeah, I know. They were silent for a moment. Maggie absently played with the empty can with her fingers as she leaned against the counter. He wondered if all the town sheriffs that had come before her had needed to deal with the same feelings of frustration and helplessness the first time they had encountered such a case. You said on the phone that you have good news, Maggie said. I could use some of that right now. Oh, yeah, right, he replied, rousing himself from his thoughts. I did some research, and I figured out a way to make sure that Mr. Skidder can't track you once he's recovered. Well, that's a relief. What do we need to do? He led her back out into the shop and went over to the bookcase. While Maggie knew in general terms what his family had been involved with over the years, there was a lot that she didn't know that she deserved to. He opened the latch and slowly pushed the bookcase away from the wall. It was time to change that. Whoa, wait, what the hell? She asked, her eyes moving between the exposed door and the front of the shop. You showed me some of your world when you had me over for dinner and introduced me to Jenny, Michael said, opening the door and stepping off to one side. Let me show you some of mine. Chapter 46. Michael spent the next 20 minutes explaining both the existence of the hidden study as well as the events that had led up to its creation. Maggie simply sat in one of the chairs and listened silently, not asking a single question as he spoke. When he finally finished, he waited for a response, but the one that she gave wasn't what he had been expecting. Okay, she said with a nod. That's it? Michael asked in surprise. You're fine with everything that I just told you? A room that shouldn't exist being created because of an evil device that also shouldn't exist isn't even the weirdest thing I've seen in the last 24 hours. I've decided to just accept it and move on. He had no reply for that. So about this thing you found that will keep the big bad demon away from me, what is it? It's actually pretty simple, he said, shaking himself out of his stupor. You just need to drink a mixture of water and half a dozen specific herbs to cleanse your body. Nothing dangerous, and I've got everything that we need here. I'm warning you, it won't taste good, but it will do the job. That's it? Yeah, that's it. Thank God, finally something easy. She leaned back in her chair. I've got some news too. I've got a major lead in the case. Michael blinked. Really? Don't sound so surprised about it. No, sorry, I don't mean it like that. I just would have thought the shooter would have kept you busy all night. He was actually what got the ball rolling. She took a moment to collect her thoughts. The shooter's name is Carl Billingsley. He's a contractor that's been working with the crews that have been expanding the downtown area over the past few years. Managing them, really. There's another guy that's supposed to oversee things, but Billingsley is the one that handles the crews on site. Nothing gets done without his go-ahead. He moved to town 2 years ago so that he didn't have to keep commuting to work when he realized that this was going to be a continuing project. Okay, I'm with you so far. That got me thinking about Mrs. Clarendon saying that she was sorry about selling some land. I went ahead and let myself into the town property records to do some digging. About a decade ago, she sold off nearly 150 acres of land that her family owned on the west side of Lamplight Woods. The west side? Michael frowned. That's just empty fields and woods, isn't it? The only thing I could think of over that way is the old Ambrose Logging Company. Maggie smiled slightly. That's what it used to be. Now, it's the home to Synthetic Material Research's facility. I didn't know that. Is it important? Maybe not by itself, but you're missing a key piece. I finally figured out what the connection is between the children. There are 4 that have been targeted so far. 2 of them are kids of SMR employees, and the other 2 have parents that work at the Nagy clinic on the outskirts of town. All of their families moved to Lamplight Woods less than 10 years ago. Wait, so... Yep, Maggie's smile became broader. Everyone that has been targeted is a new resident of Lamplight Woods. I think that someone that lived here all their life doesn't like the changes that have been going on, and they're using those demons in the form of old local legends to make their point. I'm impressed, Michael told her. Really, I am. That's some incredible detective work, Maggie. Thank you, please, no applause needed. He scratched his chin. That explains what happened with Sarah. Maggie sat up straight. What? What happened to Sarah? He raised a hand. She's okay. She and her friend Josh found the missing girl yesterday. Blake Paulson. They were out at Ambrose Lake. Holy shit. Why didn't you tell me? Did they take her back to her parents? No. Michael shook his head slowly. Unfortunately, she's been fully possessed. They barely managed to make it out alive. Fuck. Maggie closed her eyes. You said they're okay, though. That's good. They seem to be. I think Sarah's more shaken up about it than she's letting on, but neither of them is hurt. When they were telling me what happened, Josh said the girl reminded him of the legend of the well witch. The one about the witch that was drowned in a well and takes over the body of anyone that looks down into the water? He nodded. That's the one. The description fits, too. The girl had 2 hands coming out of her mouth, and they could see eyes looking at them from further inside. She even refused to go out into the rain. Supposedly the witch hates water because of how she died. Sarah was born here, but she only lived here for, what, a few months before you left with her, right? Maggie asked thoughtfully. If you look at it that way, she's an outsider. And from our mystery person's point of view, it means that she's a potential target. We need to find out whoever's behind this, and we need to do it fast. Yeah, but how do we do that? We start back at the beginning, with the missing children. We know why they were targeted, but we don't know how. They had to have come across the person behind this radar somehow. We work out how that happened, and we just might have our killer. Maggie stood up. I'll go get all the files that I have. I hope you enjoy paperwork. I'm very thorough. Chapter 47. When Maggie returned with the documents, Michael was shocked by the sheer amount of them that there were. She had said that there was quite a bit, but even with that warning, he hadn't expected there to be so much. He helped her bring in a dozen file boxes from her car and put them into the study before they started going through them. They were looking for any and all connections between the children. It was highly unlikely that they'd been chosen as demon hosts simply because their families weren't longtime citizens of Lamplight Woods. They weren't the only children that fit that description either. There had to be some other common denominator that they shared. As they went through the documents, they both kept a list of names of people that had contact with the children within a few months of their disappearances. Maggie had performed very detailed interviews with the parents. More detailed than he had ever seen, in fact. He was once again impressed by her skills. Michael had been worried from the start that their efforts were going to produce too many names. Lamplight Woods was a small town, and was often the case with small towns. Everyone knew everyone. He shook his head slightly as he flipped to a new page on his notepad. His fears were turning out to be justified. This is a lot of names, Maggie said when they had finished. There are hundreds of them between the 4 children. Comparing these lists is going to suck. Want to know a simple trick that should never have to be explained to you, but for some reason does? He asked with a small smile. It made me feel really stupid when it was pointed out to me when I was in college. Yeah, sure, go for it. We type all the names onto a spreadsheet, then sort the lines in alphabetical order. It groups all the same names together, and you just look for groups of 4. That is a really obvious solution in hindsight. I know, right? I felt like a complete moron when it was suggested to me by a teacher. I'll get my laptop. It took a few minutes to get all of the names typed onto the spreadsheet. Once he had finished, he sorted the columns in alphabetical order and started writing down the names that all 4 children had in common. It was a surprisingly short list. There are only 3 people that I'm seeing that all the children came into contact with, he said, giving the spreadsheet one last glance to make sure he wasn't missing anyone. Terry Greason, Carol Dilfer, and Morgan Clay. Mayor Dilfer is on that list? Maggie asked in surprise. I wasn't expecting that one. I think we can rule her out. It wouldn't make any sense. Why ask me to assist with the investigation if she was the cause of it? She could have just let me handle my father's affairs and leave. I never would have known that anything was happening. As much as I want to have a reason to remove her from her office kicking and screaming, you're probably right. That leaves Terry Grayson and Morgan Clay. Michael frowned. Morgan Clay. Why does that name seem familiar? Jenny mentioned her at dinner. She runs a daycare out of her house. It makes sense that all the children would have come into contact with her. A lot of the working parents in town use her. Terry Grayson owns Grayson's General Store, so the children would have seen him when they went shopping with their parents. He's a possibility, but his interactions with the children aren't nearly as personal. Besides, why would he be unhappy about the town's growth? That just means more customers and more money for him. Maggie shook her head slowly. Only 3 people on the list. How could I possibly have missed that? You couldn't have seen it, Michael assured her. Until Benjamin Henderson was possessed, there were only 3 children. There were dozens of links between the first 3. Benjamin was the key to narrowing things down to something usable. She shook her head. I still should have been able to find some connection. Michael understood the guilt that she was going through. There had been more than one case he had worked on where some key piece of the puzzle hadn't become available until after another killing or violent act had occurred. Even though realistically there hadn't been any way of him being able to put things together until that key piece was revealed, he had still felt a heavy load of guilt each and every time it happened. It's hard to believe that Morgan Clay could be the person behind this, Maggie said. I give Jenny a hard time about her, but she doesn't seem like someone that could be capable of something like this. She's great with kids. It's very possible that it's not her, he replied. This isn't exactly the most airtight case I've ever seen. We need to find out for sure. He stood up and went over to one of the many bookcases lining the study's walls. He scanned the spines of the books until he found the one he was looking for. It was an older tome, and he was careful to put as little pressure on the cover as possible when he removed it. I saw something in here the other day when I was looking into demons, he said as he opened the book and flipped through the pages. It might be able to help with... here it is. He quickly read through the passage to confirm that he remembered it correctly. He passed the book over to Maggie and sat down on the edge of the desk while she read. She looked up at him when she had finished. I've never heard of diatomaceous earth before, she admitted. It's a type of rock that's formed from the remains of aquatic organisms, Michael explained. The kind that's sold in stores as a powder made from grinding up the rock. It's used for a lot of different things, everything from being a food supplement to killing fleas and bedbugs. It says here that it can be used to detect the use of spells and rituals. Yeah, it's not exactly a major use that's advertised on the back of the bag, but diatomaceous earth absorbs lingering traces of that kind of power on contact. It changes color almost immediately. We can use it to see if Miss Crane has been engaging in any summoning rituals. We'll move down the list if we don't find anything. Does it have to come into contact with a person? He shook his head. No, it just has to come in contact with the traces of magic in the air. Maggie nodded once. Good. I wasn't sure I was going to explain to Morgan why I needed her to stick her finger into powder made from dead fish. Chapter 48. This all looks like gibberish to me, Josh said as he looked through the pages for a 3rd time. Sarah had to admit that he was right. Nothing on the pages seemed to have a real meaning. The damage from the water might have destroyed some important information that could have made everything make sense, or maybe without context, there wasn't a way to decipher what any of it had to do with, well, anything. Whatever the case, the writings were utter nonsense in their current state. She had been true to her word. Instead of going to the Fordham cabin to investigate the drawing in her grandfather's journal as they had originally planned, Josh had picked her up and they had gone straight over to the house he lived in with his grandmother. It was a rather small home, but she liked it. The place felt more cozy than claustrophobic. Yeah, you're right, she conceded, closing the journal. I mean, clearly my grandfather's working on something, but there's no way to tell what it was. You didn't know him very well, right? He asked as he set the stack of papers down on the bed next to him. I didn't know him at all. My dad and I left a few months after I was born. Is it possible that he was, well, completely batshit crazy? She shrugged. Who knows? Maybe. This doesn't feel like a crazy person's work, though. Well, maybe a little crazy. What I mean is that there's a kind of weird rhyme and reason to it. I think we're just missing something that will bring it all together. She sighed again and loaded everything into her backpack. There was no point in obsessing over it. It was frustrating. She had been so sure that the journal was important, and she had been convinced that she would be able to work out what her grandfather had been working on. Then they had found the pages in the trailer. What were the odds of that happening? It was like she had been meant to find them. Now, though, she was just banging her head against a wall. You need to keep your eyes open, Josh said. Why is that? She asked, turning her head towards him. You found the journal in your grandfather's room and the other pages in that trailer. I get the feeling that there's going to be bits and pieces of this scattered all over the place. Her mood brightened a bit. You think so? I do. There's all sorts of weird stuff going on around Lamplight Woods, and none of it has easy answers. Why would this be different, right? She smiled. Right. Thanks for that. Thanks for what? Just thanks. She tilted her head slightly. How's your nose doing? He touched it gingerly. It's okay. I'm lucky that I didn't break it when I fell. It's just sore. That's good. Yeah, can't complain. I'm getting a little hungry. You want to go get something to eat? Sure, just as long as it's somewhere with other people around. He nodded. Don't worry, I wouldn't ask you to break your promise to your dad. I know a place. A few minutes later, Josh was backing his small car out of the driveway. Sarah found it amusing to see him hunched over in the driver's seat. Even with the seat lowered as far as it would go, his head still pressed up against the roof. He must have noticed her looking at him because he shot her a quick smile. Do you find something comical about my appearance when I am driving my automobile? He asked in an exaggerated voice. That is quite the deep-cut Simpsons reference, she noted. Why, thank you. I pride myself on being as obscure as possible. This isn't the most comfortable car in the world to drive, but it was my grandmother's before she upgraded. She gave it to me when I got my license. What is your grandmother driving now? A heavy-duty pickup with an extended cab and absolutely massive tires. She laughed. She sounds like my kind of person. I can't wait to meet her. She'll be home from work in a few hours, so you'll get your chance. Sarah expected Josh to drive towards downtown, but instead, he headed in the opposite direction. She raised an eyebrow as she watched out the window. Granted, she hadn't been in town for very long, but she didn't know that there were places to eat that weren't in the main section. About 10 minutes later, he turned down a small side street. The road only went out for a few blocks, but both sides were packed with parked cars. A truck was pulling out just ahead of them, and Josh parked the car in the spot that had opened up. He undid his seatbelt and got out of the car. Not wanting to be left behind, she did the same. At the far end of the street was a food truck. It was red and white, and a striped cloth overhang jutted out over the open window. Even from this distance, she could see the man working in the kitchen. He was extremely muscular, to the point that she wondered how he moved around inside without banging off the walls. Dozens of people were surrounding the truck, some already having been served, and others waiting for their food. Welcome to Wally's Barbecue, Josh said as they walked towards the line. It's the absolute best food here in Lamplight Woods. Wally's the giant in the truck. 3 times a week he makes fresh barbecue and opens up shop for lunch. And this many people show up? Sarah asked in surprise. Looks like half the town is here. I don't think you understand just how good this food is. You'll know why everyone's here when you try it. They got in line and waited for their turn. Sarah passed the time by looking around at the people that had gathered. She recognized a few of them from seeing them around town over the past week, but most of the patrons were unfamiliar to her. After a few minutes, she noticed that someone was looking back at her. It was a woman a little younger than her father, probably closer to Sheriff Grant's age. She was wearing jeans and a light blue button-up shirt, and her feet were adorned with black shoes. At first, Sarah thought the woman might be looking beyond her to someone behind her. When she casually turned her head to check, however, there was no one there. She turned back to find the woman still standing there and staring. It was a little unsettling. "Hey, Josh," she said, nudging him on the elbow. "Who's that?" "Which person?" he asked, looking the direction that she indicated. "There, the woman in the blue shirt, the one with the short hair." "Oh, the one next to the bald guy on the crutches?" "Yeah, her." "Oh, that's Miss Clay," Josh told her. "She runs a daycare here in Lamplight Woods." Chapter 49. Maggie was surprised to find that Grayson's general store had diatomaceous earth in stock. She found it on the bottom shelf in the gardening section, and judging by the dust on the bag, there wasn't much call for it. When she purchased the 10-pound bag, the man behind the counter, Terry Grayson, commented that he had never actually sold the product to anyone before. It had been a special order for a customer that had never picked it up. She smiled at him and thanked him for the help. While she did so, however, she carefully watched him for any signs of anything out of the ordinary. He was one of the 3 people that had come into contact with the missing children a short time before their various disappearances. If he was at all nervous, he didn't show it. Driving over to Morgan Clay's house, she parked the car and opened the bag to look inside. The diatomaceous earth was light brown, and it felt like sand as she ran her fingers through it. Michael had told her that she wouldn't need much of it for it to work, so she had brought a couple of plastic sandwich bags with her. She scooped a handful of the powder into both bags and slid them into her pocket. She wasn't sure how she was going to handle this. She had run through a few scenarios in her head, but it wasn't like this was something that had ever come up before. She was just going to have to wing it. Maggie got out of the car and took a quick look around. It didn't seem like many, if any, of Morgan's neighbors were home. There weren't any cars in the driveways or parked along the street. It would have been easy to imagine that the entire block had been abandoned. As she walked up the sidewalk towards the front door, she passed a small white sign hanging from a post. The words "Sunny Friends Daycare" were hand-painted on it in a wide variety of colors. The sign was slightly tilted to the right, as if it had been bumped into at some point and not put back into its original state. She reached the front door and found a different sign waiting for her. Hanging on the inside of the glass was a small note stating that the daycare was closed due to illness. She knocked on the door. There was no response. She thought about trying to open the door, but she stopped herself before her hand reached the doorknob. She couldn't just enter a residence like that. She had been skirting the edges of illegal entry when she had gone to Grace Clarendon's house, but at least then she had had the excuse of being worried about the elderly woman's safety. This was quite a bit different. Morgan Clay was a suspect in an ongoing investigation. Procedure called for a search warrant before she could enter the premises without the owner's consent. Maggie's eyes narrowed. She was sure that she could acquire a warrant if necessary. She was friendly with the local magistrate, and if any further push was needed, she knew that Mayor Dilfer would put on some pressure. Just because she could do it didn't mean that she should, though. At the moment, the only thing that linked Morgan to the disappearances was an association with all the missing children that could easily be explained away. That wasn't nearly enough to completely upend the woman's life. She turned to leave. She hadn't gone more than a few feet when she noticed something across the street. In between 2 of the houses was a vacant lot. It was overgrown, the grass and weeds so tall that it would have come up to at least her waist. The lot backed up to the woods, where there was a small gap between the trees. She cursed herself for not realizing where she was sooner. As a teenager, she had visited the empty lot often. The gap in the trees was a path that led to Ambrose Lake. Morgan could have easily seen Sarah Dyer and Josh Taylor pass through the lot and into the trees from her house. She glanced back at the house and considered things. Coming to a decision, she went back up onto the porch and removed one of the baggies of diatomaceous earth from her pocket. She opened it and poured half the contents into her hand. Not sure how this was supposed to work, she waited. It only took a few seconds. The light brown powder quickly turned black and compressed into a hard lump. Within moments, she was holding something that looked very much like a piece of charcoal. There was no way this could be considered a scientific test. It wasn't something that could be used as evidence, and it certainly wouldn't hold up in any court. What it did do, however, was convince her that she had found the person she was looking for. She went back to her car. It was almost impossible to reconcile the Morgan Clay that she knew with someone that was hurting both children and adults. She needed to know the motive behind it. That was the piece of the puzzle that was still missing. She waited for a few minutes to see if Morgan would return home, but when nothing happened, she started up the car. Reaching for her cell phone, she quickly dialed a number. "Morgan Clay is definitely our perp," she said as soon as the call was answered. "I know," Michael said, an odd tone in his voice. "The powder turned black and hard right when I took it out of the bag, and—" She paused. "What do you mean, you know?" "I mean that I know that she's the one behind everything. There's no question about it anymore." "How?" He was silent for a moment. "If I tell you this, I need to be talking with Maggie Grant, my friend, not Maggie Grant, Lamplight Woods Sheriff." She made a face. "I'm not going to like this, am I?" "Okay, fine. You're speaking with your friend. Go on." "I called up an associate of mine that works for, well, let's just say that he works for a certain government agency and leave it at that. I asked him to run a background check for me on Morgan Clay. Don't worry, it was completely off the record. Nothing is going to get back to the mayor or anyone else." "I'm sure that you're aware that kind of favor isn't strictly legal." "Talking with my friend here and not the sheriff, right?" She passed a hand over her face. Yeah, we're just two buddies talking here. What did your associate find?" She heard the sound of rustling papers. "There wasn't a whole lot about her time in Lamplight Woods," Michael said. "That's not surprising. However, there are a few incidents when she was in college that got flagged. My contact managed to find some records and transcripts that, well, they put some things into perspective about why she's doing what she's doing." "Okay, I'll be right over," Maggie told him, hanging up the phone. Chapter 50. The food was every bit as good as Josh had hyped it up to be. Sarah was instantly hooked the moment that she took the first bite from the ribs she ordered. She closed her eyes and just enjoyed the smoky flavor for half a minute before opening them again and swallowing. "Oh my God," she said, grabbing one of the napkins they had set on the hood of his car. "I don't want to say that I told you so," Josh said as he took a sip from his drink, "but I absolutely told you so. This is phenomenal. You can't get anything like this in San Diego." "I'm pretty sure you can't get it anywhere else. You should try the chicken next time. It's incredible." She smiled and sighed in satisfaction. The smile slipped slightly as she realized that there might not be a next time. Once her father finished up on the police case he was assisting with and figured out things with Forgotten Tales, they would be heading back to the West Coast. She watched as Josh devoured his pulled pork sandwich. A week ago she had been complaining about coming to Lamplight Woods. Now she was feeling sad at the prospect of leaving. It didn't even make any sense. She had bounced from horror to horror during her time here. She should want to get as far away from it as humanly possible. If she was being honest with herself, though, she didn't want to leave. That realization both surprised and confused her. They had been two of the last people to arrive for the lunch rush. Most of the gathered crowd had already finished eating and left. She hadn't seen one dissatisfied look as the people had passed them. "Hello, Joshua," a woman's voice said. Sarah had been lost in her thoughts, and she jumped slightly at the sound of the voice. She looked up to find the woman that she had noticed staring at them standing next to Josh, a polite smile on her face. "Oh, hello, Miss Clay," he replied, returning the smile. "How are you this afternoon?" "I'm doing well, thank you," the woman replied. "Who's your friend?" "My name is Sarah Dyer," Sarah said. "Pleased to meet you." "Dyer? You wouldn't happen to be related to Gerald Dyer, would you?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm his granddaughter." Really? How interesting. I didn't know that he had any grandchildren. The conversation was pleasant and polite, but something was setting off warning bells in the back of Sarah's head. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. She seemed to be scrutinizing them. Well, I won't keep the two of you, Miss Clay said. I just wanted to come over and say hello. She started to walk away, but she turned back to them after only a few steps. The smile was gone from her face. It had been replaced by a look that Sarah couldn't quite identify. One last thing, the woman said. I heard that your father is assisting Sheriff Grant with finding those missing children. Does he think that they'll be able to find them? He doesn't talk about cases with me, Sarah told her slowly. My dad is really good at his job, though, so I'm sure they'll find them. I see. Well, good then. She spun on her heel and hurried over to her car. She got in and drove away, leaving both Sarah and Josh feeling extremely confused about the conversation they had just been a part of. They turned to each other, and both of them shrugged at the same time. Any idea what that was about? Sarah asked as she went back to eating her ribs. No clue, Josh confirmed. I've known her for a long time. I used to get dropped off at her daycare whenever my grandmother had to do something. I've never seen her like that before. She looked, I don't know, crazed. Maybe she's sick? She suggested. Yeah, that could be it. She was sweating and pale. Hopefully she's not contagious. There was a loud rumbling noise as the truck pulling the Wally's barbecue trailer went down the road past them. Sarah caught a brief glimpse of the large man behind the wheel. He waved at her before continuing on his way. Wally's one of the good ones, Josh told her. He doesn't say much, and he looks really intimidating, but he does whatever he can to make his customers happy. He does a lot of volunteer work, too. She had just opened her mouth to respond when she saw something across the street. Standing in the shadows between two houses, her hair matted and tangled, was the little girl they had encountered at the lake. She was staring at them with the same blank expression on her face. The nightgown she was wearing was even more filthy than it had been the previous day. Well, witch, Sarah whispered. Sorry, what was that? Josh asked, not hearing her over the noise of the last of the cars leaving. The fucking well witch, she practically yelled, pointing at the girl. His eyes widened as he turned towards where she was indicating. Oh, shit. We need to go. Right fucking now. They got in the car. Sarah watched the girl as Josh pulled the car out onto the road and drove away. She didn't move, but her eyes followed them until she was out of view. It wasn't the lake, Sarah muttered. What? Josh asked as he drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I thought that she was coming after us at the lake because it was secluded. I was wrong. She's still after us, and that was a hell of a lot more public of a place. Great. We have a stalker. What do we do? Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She did know the one person that might, though. We need to go back to my house, she said. My dad will know what to do. Are you sure about that? Josh asked skeptically. No, but it's our best and only option. Chapter 51. All right, Maggie said as she leaned against the store counter. Tell me what you found out about Morgan Clay. Michael nodded and flipped through the stapled stack of papers he was holding. His contact at the FBI had been extremely thorough in a very short amount of time, and there was a lot to process. Most of the information was just a collection of small items that weren't meaningful, so the trick was to pick through everything and figure out what actually mattered. As far as I can tell, she was just a typical kid growing up here in Lamplight Woods, he began, setting the papers down on one of the store's shelves. There wasn't anything that really stood out. Good student, friends, various extracurricular activities. Basically your typical small-town kid. You're sounding like an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, Maggie said impatiently. Yeah, okay, I get it. Fast forward to college. She's accepted into Brigham Young on a partial scholarship, and she heads off to Utah to study early developmental teaching. She wants to become a teacher for young children. With you so far. Nothing happens her freshman and sophomore years, at least nothing that I know of. She starts dating a guy named Charles Reed, and she moves into a small apartment with a woman named Hazel Watterson. He took a sip of water from his cup. Now it's her junior year. During Christmas break, both her boyfriend and her roommate disappear. Morgan is back in Lamplight Woods for the holidays at the time, so she isn't seen as a person of interest in the disappearances. Their bodies are found the day before she returns to college at a construction site a few blocks from her apartment. They're mangled almost beyond identification. One of the investigating officers described them as looking like they'd been mauled by wild animals. Christ, Maggie muttered. This is the start of a string of killings that all have some connection to Morgan Clay. One of her teachers is found murdered in an alley behind a motel. A woman she works with at the campus bookstore is torn to pieces in a restaurant parking lot during the night. A classmate is ripped in half and left floating in a pool. If these people were all connected to her, she has to have been investigated as a suspect, Maggie said. Michael shook his head. Not thoroughly. She had an airtight alibi for every killing. There were some other people with connections to all the victims as well, and some of them didn't have alibis for all the murders. It would have been difficult for the police to focus on her as the killer, not to mention that they weren't even sure if all the killings were even related. But you're sure that she is connected to them. My contact included the case files for the victims, at least the parts available to the public. I didn't print them off because it would have taken hours, but I did give each one a quick look. Clay's boyfriend and roommate had been spotted together at a movie the night before they went missing. The theater's assistant manager recognized them because he had seen them groping each other before the movie started. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Her boyfriend was cheating on her with her roommate. That's definitely motive. The woman at the bookstore that worked with Clay was a known bully, one of those rich kids that looked down on everyone around them. The teacher had multiple complaints about unwanted sexual advances towards female students. The guy at the pool was not only a known drug dealer, but he's suspected of being a thief as well. I see where you're going with this. Maggie crossed her arms over her chest. You're saying that Morgan went on some, divine crusade against people that wronged her? Exactly. In her mind, it probably wasn't even murder. It was balancing the scales. I think that she summoned demons just like she has here in Lamplight Woods, and she used them to kill off those people. That's how she always had an alibi. She didn't have to be present for the demons to do their jobs. I have to admit that makes sense. Okay, let's say that's true. Why is she continuing it here in Lamplight Woods? Michael flipped to a specific page in the pile and tore it out, handing it over to her. The expansion of Lamplight Woods has had some negative effects on her life. According to a court filing, before she moved back to town, she had a handshake agreement with Grace Clarendon to buy some land to build a house on. Clarendon ended up terminating that agreement when SMR offered her a much higher number and purchased all of it instead of just a single lot. Well, fuck. Her parents both died within the space of a year, and they were both against Dilfer's plan to expand the town. Very vocally, in fact. Apparently things got pretty heated during a town hall meeting, and they stormed out of it vowing to stop the expansion. From what I can tell, they were just this side of being isolationists. They wanted Lamplight Woods to stay the way it always had been, and the expansion plan was the exact opposite of that. Maggie closed her eyes. So Morgan believes that her family has been wronged, and she starts to go after the people that she holds responsible. She takes it one step further, too. She uses the children of people she sees as invaders of her hometown to do it. What a sick fuck. Michael nodded. The problem is that we can't prove any of this. There's no solid physical evidence linking Morgan Clay to any of the murders. Well, if it helps, you've definitely convinced me. He smiled. That actually does help. The front door of the store was flung open so hard that it shook the walls. Sarah and Josh hurried inside and slammed the door shut. They looked terrified. What's wrong? Michael demanded, immediately moving towards them. It's the well witch, Sarah said, trying to catch her breath. What about her? She popped up again when we were getting lunch. We came right here, but she was waiting for us when we got here. She's here now? She's just outside. Michael went over to the closest window and looked out, with Maggie joining him a few seconds later. Standing in the middle of the front yard, her hair a tangled mess and her nightgown covered in dirt, was a young girl. He recognized her as Blake Paulson, one of the missing children. His jaw tightened as a thought came to him. It hadn't been that long ago that Sarah had been her age. He couldn't imagine how scared she must have been as the demon began to take hold of her. A car pulled up in the road behind her and a woman got out. He didn't recognize her, but Maggie did. Morrigan Clay, she hissed from between clenched teeth. Clay said a few words to the girl that he couldn't hear before getting back in her car and driving away. The child watched her leave before she turned her head towards the window they were looking out of and slowly opened her mouth. It opened far wider than it should have been able to, revealing a black void within it. Fingers began to appear from inside the void. They reached out and gripped onto each side of the girl's mouth, forcing the opening wider. There was something else in the center of the darkness, but he couldn't quite make out what it was. It was rounded, like the top of a head. Two silvery orbs became visible. They were the eyes of whatever creature existed inside. "What do we do?" Sarah asked him anxiously. "Go lock every door and window," Michael instructed her, not taking his eyes off of the demon. "Close the curtains and blinds. We need to make it as difficult as possible for it to get inside. Once you do that, go find Mira and keep close to it." "Right." She grabbed Josh's hand and they hurried off to lock down Forgotten Tales. "Can she be saved, do you think?" Maggie asked, bringing up a question that he hadn't even considered. "I don't know," he replied hesitantly. "I think the boys that have become Mr. Skitter and Skinrod are too far gone, but I don't know about her. This looks like a different kind of transformation. Two separate entities instead of one. Michael, we have to try." "We will. We have to make sure that she doesn't kill us first, though." "Salt, iron, and silver, right?" He nodded. "Check the top right drawer in the desk in the study. I packed some rock salt shells for you and put them in there. Your shotgun is still in the trunk of your car, right?" "Yeah." She shook her head. "I won't be able to get to it with her out there." "Go get the shells. Grab me one of the pokers from next to the fireplace, too. They're made of iron." Maggie looked at him suspiciously. "What exactly are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that you need a distraction so that you can get to that shotgun." Chapter 52. Between the two of them, Sarah and Josh managed to secure all the doors and windows on the first floor within a few minutes. The thick curtains blocked out much of the sunlight, casting everything in an odd dim orangish brown. They also prevented the heat from escaping, and both teenagers were sweating by the time they reached the second floor and continued their work. Sarah paused as she came to the final room. It was her grandfather's bedroom, and even though she had already been in it once, there was still a strange sense of foreboding. It felt like she wasn't supposed to go inside. She shook off the feeling and opened the door. Everything was exactly as she had left it. She crossed over to the single window, made sure that the lock was engaged, and pulled the curtain shut. "I've got the bathroom windows taken care of," Josh said as he joined her in the hallway. "The small one up near the ceiling doesn't have blinds, so I shoved some towels up against it to block the view." "Good idea," she said. "Have you seen Mira?" "Yeah, it's sleeping in your room." He had barely finished the sentence when Mira walked out of the bedroom, the hair on its back standing up. It either sensed that something was wrong, or their mad dash through the house had freaked it out. She had to admit that it wasn't the only one feeling on edge. She snapped her head towards the stairs when she heard the front door being opened. Her first instinct was to run downstairs to see what was going on, but she resisted the urge. Instead, she went over to the top step and listened. "What is it?" Josh asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. I'm not sure, she admitted. It sounds like my dad is outside yelling. She hesitated briefly before going back into her grandfather's room. Out of all the rooms on the second floor, it offered the best view of the front lawn. She gripped the curtain but paused before opening it. Her father had specifically told her to close everything. She could hear him shouting, though, and she needed to know if he was all right. She pushed aside the curtain as little as possible and peered out. The Well Witch was standing on the lawn. She had gotten closer to the house, but she was turned away from the front door. At first, Sarah couldn't see what she was looking at, but then her father came into view near the side of the house. He was holding a long fireplace poker and was speaking loudly to the girl. It was difficult to make out what he was saying. It didn't matter, however. Sheriff Grant appeared from under the roof of the porch and slowly made her way towards the car. Sarah's father was acting as a distraction, keeping the Well Witch's attention firmly on him so that the sheriff could make it to the vehicle. Without warning, the Well Witch spun around to face the woman. Sheriff Grant froze for half a second before giving up all pretense of stealth and making a run for the car. She wasn't going to make it, and it was clear that she knew it. The girl didn't make a move to stop her, however. Instead, the Well Witch bolted towards the front door so fast that Sarah barely registered what was happening. The sound of wood splintering and breaking was audible through the bedroom floor. It grew louder as the door was assaulted a second time. Her father was shouting again, but there was a different tone in his voice this time. He wasn't just trying to distract the child anymore. He was challenging it. There was a thumping noise on the side of the house. It was followed by a series of pops and cracks. Her father was looking up now, his face both angry and frightened. He disappeared under the porch roof. "Oh, shit," Sarah exclaimed, hurriedly letting go of the curtain and nearly tripping over the edge of the bed as she ran back out into the hallway. "What?" Josh demanded. "She's climbing up the side of the house." The ceiling above them creaked. The Well Witch had reached the roof. They could hear the sound of light footsteps moving across the shingles. Mira bared its fangs but didn't make a sound. The footsteps moved over to the far side of the roof. They stopped as they reached the edge of the house above Sarah's bedroom. Moving as quietly as she could, she crept over to the door and carefully closed it. It squeaked on its hinges as it moved, but it wasn't loud enough that it could be heard from outside. She motioned to the top of the stairs and started towards them. She stopped when she saw Josh forcefully waving at her not to go down them. He pointed up at the ceiling, then brought his index finger down so that it was pointing at the floor. He was trying to tell her something, but she wasn't understanding. She frowned and shook her head. Giving up on the miming, he instead silently mouthed a single word. "Chimney." Her eyes widened as she nodded. The Well Witch was on the side of the house with the chimney. If the girl heard them moving down the stairs, she could simply drop down the chimney and be directly in their path. They needed to wait for her to make her move so that they could react accordingly. Glass shattered on the other side of the bedroom door as the Well Witch broke through the window. Sarah and Josh looked at each other for a split second before both starting down the stairs. She was coming in on the second floor. It meant that they were clear to head downstairs. They almost made it to the landing halfway down the stairs when the window there burst inward. The curtains were ripped down, and a snake-like creature came through the opening. Sarah froze on the step she was standing on. It was black and red, and it reminded her of severely burned flesh. There were 3 appendages on the front of it, and dozens of small eyes stared out from holes along its body. She realized that it wasn't a snake that she was looking at. The 3 appendages were fingers, the same kind that she had seen reach out from the Well Witch's mouth. What was blocking their path was one of the arms that were attached to those fingers, and a possibly long arm with eyes covering it. Abandoning their plan, they turned and bolted back up the stairs. The arm lashed out, and the fingers barely missed Sarah's legs as they rounded the corner. Josh was slightly ahead of her, and he threw his body up against the door to her bedroom in an attempt to keep it closed as it shook violently. "Please tell me you have a plan," he said, gritting his teeth as the door shook again. She looked around as she desperately tried to come up with one. More windows began to break in the other upstairs rooms, and she hurriedly shut the remaining doors. As she closed the one leading into the bathroom, she caught a glimpse of another arm slithering inside. At first she thought it was the same one that had attacked them on the landing, but she could still hear that one moving around down below. "I've got nothing," she admitted. She jumped as her phone rang. She hadn't even remembered that she had it on her. She quickly pulled it out of her pocket and answered it. "Sarah," her father practically yelled into her ear. "Are you okay?" That depends on your definition of okay," she told him. "We're trapped on the second floor. There are all these arm things coming through the windows. We can't get downstairs." "All right, listen closely. Go over to the hallway closet." She did as she was told. "Okay, Dad, now what?" "Open the door." She pulled the door open and looked inside. There were coats hanging from a metal rod, and near the top was a shelf packed with shoeboxes. There wasn't much else. "Feel around where the back wall meets the floor," he told her. "You're looking for a small switch. It's somewhere near the left corner." Trying to ignore the banging coming from every room around her, she got down on her knees and ran her hand slowly over the section of floor her father had indicated. It took a few moments, but the tips of her fingers eventually touched metal. "I found it," she said. "Good," her father answered. "Press it." She pushed down the switch. With a quiet hiss of escaping air, the back wall of the closet slid upward a couple of inches. Momentarily forgetting the danger they were in, she pushed the wall all the way up along its hidden track. It moved easily. Behind it was a narrow spiral staircase that led downward. "Sarah?" her father prompted, his voice nervous. "I'm here, Dad," she assured him. "There are some stairs." "Good. The three of you need to go down there and wait for me to come get you. Shut the closet door when you're inside and close the wall behind you. You won't get any signal on your phone, so I just need you to wait, okay?" "Okay, Dad, what is this? Some kind of panic room?" "Something like that. Forgotten Tales has a lot of secrets. Now hurry and get out of there." "What about you?" "I'll be okay. Trust me. Go." Chapter 53. Michael hung up the phone and looked back up at the creature standing on the roof. The girl's head was tilted back, and half a dozen tentacle-like arms were extended out from her open mouth. There had to be some limit as to how far they could reach, but if there was, they hadn't hit it yet. They had broken into the house from every direction as they sought out Sarah and Josh. At least the kids were safe. The staircase in the closet led far below Forgotten Tales, and there was no way this thing was going to find them down there. That meant that he could focus on how to stop it without worrying about Sarah. "I think I prefer Mr. Skidder," Maggie commented as she loaded the rock salt shells into her shotgun. "At least he can only come at you from one direction." Her voice was steady and light, but he could tell that she was forcing it to be. He had to admit that he was scared as well. He'd always thought of Forgotten Tales as a sanctuary, somewhere that was protected from the supernatural. Having that misguided belief shattered was unnerving. "We have to get her down from the roof," he said. "We can't risk taking her on up there." "My thoughts exactly," Maggie agreed. "Even if we manage to miraculously stop her up there, it's a steep roof. Blake might fall." He nodded. If they were going to have any chance of separating the girl from the demon, they had to ensure that she wasn't seriously hurt. That had added more complication to an already extremely complicated situation. "I'm open to suggestions," he said. Maggie didn't respond. Instead, she reached down and picked up a rock from the ground. She hefted it a few times to gauge the weight. When she was seemingly satisfied, she took a step back and hurled it up at the girl. The rock landed on the roof a few feet away from the well witch. At first, Michael thought Maggie had missed, but when the sheriff nodded, he realized that she hadn't actually been aiming at the child. She had just been trying to get her attention. The sound of the rock striking the shingles was loud, and a few of the arms retracted out of the house and moved towards the noise. Maggie was already aiming the shotgun. It was a long shot, especially with rock salt loaded instead of standard ammunition. She pulled the trigger, and the weapon roared as it fired. Two of the arms jerked violently. The girl shrieked in pain, and the arms that had remained inside the house pulled back and swung towards the threat. "That worked," Maggie said as she pumped another shell into the chamber. "A little too well," Michael commented as he started to back up slowly. The arms had gripped the edges of the roof and lifted the girl's body into the air. They started to move back down the side of the building like a hideous six-legged spider. All of the eyes that were embedded into the arms were staring directly at them. "At least she's coming down from the roof," Maggie said. "Yeah, right down on top of us," Michael shot back. "We need to deal with those arms if we're going to have any chance at this." "How are we going to do that?" "I don't—" He stopped as he thought of something. "Okay, I might have an idea. I don't know if it'll work, but it might." "I'm all ears." Before he could respond, the well witch leaped off the side of the house. They each ran in a different direction, and the creature landed hard on the ground where they'd been standing less than a second before. Two arms whipped out, one towards each of them. Maggie managed to fend hers off with another blast from the shotgun, but Michael was forced to throw himself out of the way. He winced as he struck the hard ground and scrambled back to his feet. "Get to the backyard," he yelled as he sprinted down the driveway. He risked a glance over his shoulder as he ran. The well witch had decided to follow Maggie instead of him, probably because the gun made her a bigger threat. There wasn't anything that he could do to help her, so he turned his attention back to what he was doing and hoped that she would be all right. He ignored the garage and instead headed towards the small shed at the far end of the yard. He reached it and flung the door open. Breathing heavily, he opened the hatch and turned around just in time to see Maggie coming around the other side of the house. The well witch was close behind her. She saw him waving at her and adjusted her course so that she was coming directly towards him. Maggie was running surprisingly fast, but she shouldn't have been able to get away from the creature that was chasing her. It had shown that when it was breaking into the house, the arms could extend to great lengths. If it just reached out with one of them while the other five continued to propel it forward, it would easily be able to catch her. The fact that it wasn't doing so was telling. Either she had heard it with the shotgun more than he had originally thought, or it was being overly cautious. Whatever the case, he hoped that it would give his plan more of a chance of working. He went down the steps and into the slaughterhouse-like room below. He turned on the power, and the overhead lights flickered on. Next to the breaker box were two small red buttons that he had noticed when he had come down earlier in the week. He pressed the bottom one and felt a small surge of relief as the sharp hooks attached to the ceiling began to lower. They stopped a few inches above the concrete floor. Maggie barely made it to the stairs before the well witch smashed into the shed. She ducked as she hurried down the steps. Debris rained down through the hatch as the shed was ripped free from the yard and broken into countless pieces. She stopped at the bottom of the steps as she saw where she was. Her expression was a combination of curiosity and revulsion. She quickly shook it off and came over to help him as he grabbed two of the hooks. "Two per arm?" she asked, indicating that she had caught onto his plan. "Hopefully it will be enough," Michael answered. There was a big flaw in his idea, and he knew it. If the well witch decided to retreat back inside the girl and simply walk down the stairs, they were going to be trapped. It could reach the bottom of the stairs, open the mouth, and kill them with little trouble. He was betting on the demon continuing to be cautious. He smiled tightly as the first arm snaked down through the hatch and into the room. The well witch was using it to scout ahead. Before it could react, he lunged forward and sank the hook he was holding into the flesh. The arm whipped back and forth as it tried to get free, but the hook and chain held. Maggie took the opportunity to dig hers into the space between the fingers. The second arm came faster than he was expecting, and he barely had time to move out of the way as it lashed out at him. Maggie grabbed a hook in each hand and swung them down as hard as she could. The points pierced deep into the skin, and she twisted them hard to the right to really sink them in. Both trapped arms flailed wildly, but they remained restrained. "I think it's working," Maggie said in a tone that made it clear that she hadn't been hopeful about the plan. Michael had expected a third arm to appear, but nothing happened. He scowled. "Shit," he muttered. "It knows what we're up to." I think it's worse than that, Maggie said. Look. 2 small feet appeared at the top of the steps. The girl herself was entering the room. That meant that all 4 arms were going to be available to use at the same time in less than a minute. When that happened, they were going to be easily overwhelmed. Where does that door go? Maggie asked, pointing at the heavy metal door on the other side of the room. Into a short tunnel that leads to a wide room with cages, he answered. Cages? No, never mind. We don't have time for that now. Maggie, I swear that I had nothing to do with this place. Later, Michael. They turned the large wheel together and opened the door. They only managed to get a few steps inside of the tunnel before the well witch reached the first room and screamed at them in rage. Michael tried to get the door shut again, but 2 of the arms shot out of her mouth and forced it back open before he could lock it. He ran to the opposite end of the passageway. Maggie had already gotten the second door open, and this time they were able to get through it and lock it behind them before the well witch could catch up. I can't believe we made it, Maggie said, setting the end of the shotgun down on the ground while she took a few deep breaths. Yeah, Michael replied. The only problem is that now we're trapped in here. There was a loud boom as the metal door shook in its frame. Dust and dirt fell from the room's ceiling as the vibration ran through it. The door shook again, and this time he saw one of the heavy bolts holding the frame to the wall come partly out. At the rate it was going, the well witch would break through in a matter of minutes. Okay, maybe that's not our only problem, he admitted. Chapter 54. The winding staircase went down much further than Sarah had expected. She'd always been a terrible judge of height and distance, but it was obvious that they had gone well below the house's basement by the time they reached the bottom. There were no lights, and they needed to use their phones to illuminate the darkness. At the very bottom of the metal stairs was a wooden door. It was heavy and ornate, with leaves and vines having been carved into it by someone with a lot of skill. She ran a hand over it. It was cooler than she had expected it to be. Are we on the right floor? Josh asked. What? She responded, confused by the question. The stairs keep going down. She turned her phone's light in the direction that he was indicating. While the stairs they had followed stopped on this floor, there was another set of them near the wall that continued down into the darkness. She leaned over the hole slightly to look down, and she felt cold air rising up out of it. I don't know, she said. Dad said to go down the stairs, but he didn't say how far. They stood in silence for a couple of minutes. The glow from his phone revealed enough of his face to show that Josh was nervous. She knew exactly how he felt. I think these other stairs are newer, he said finally. They're made of a different metal, and there isn't any rust on them. Maybe my grandfather put them in after my dad and I left, Sarah suggested. Let's try the door. There's no point in going down further than we need to. He nodded once. She went back to the door and turned the bronze doorknob. It moved easily in her hand. She pushed it open, and they went into the room beyond. There's a switch here, Josh said as he examined the wall just inside the door with his phone. Go for it, she prompted. He flipped the switch, and a series of lights attached to the ceiling turned on. The space was larger than it had first seemed, easily as large as the main house's first floor. It was the strangest room that she had ever been in, and that was including the hidden study. One wall was filled with old televisions and computer monitors. They stretched from the floor to the ceiling on wooden shelves and metal mounts. Directly in front of them was a table that resembled the kind used in her school's chemistry classroom. On top of it was a computer tower that had to have been close to 30 years old. It even had a drive for floppy disks. A tan square monitor and a yellowed keyboard were attached to it. The opposite wall featured a collection of tubes, beakers, and other glass instruments that looked like they had been taken right out of a 1950s mad scientist movie. Liquids of all colors and consistencies filled the containers. Some of the containers sat on top of burners that clearly hadn't been used in years. The rest of the room was packed with cardboard boxes, plastic containers, and other assorted items. Sarah lifted a flap on one of the boxes and found that it contained a small skeleton. It looked like a human infant skeleton, except that there were two wing-like protrusions coming out of the spine. "What is this place?" Josh asked, his voice hushed. She didn't have an answer for him. She watched as the computer tower booted up, its hard drive grinding and screeching as it did so. It must have been set to turn on and off with a light switch. She looked up as one by one the televisions and monitors on the wall turned on. Some of the images were displayed in color, but the majority of them were in black and white. Each picture showed something different. "What the hell is this?" Josh asked, going over to one of the monitors. "Is this live?" He was looking at the image of a large iron gate. It was halfway open, its broken lock lying on the ground next to it. Sarah noticed that the trees in the background were moving as the wind blew through them. It wasn't a picture. It was a video. "No, wait, it's not," he corrected himself. "There's a timestamp in the corner." She joined him at the monitor and looked closer. In the top right corner of the screen was a date, March 28th, 2007. The time next to it indicated that it was just after midnight. "I don't get it," she asked. "What's so important about a gate?" Her nerves were still frayed from their escape from the well witch, and she jumped when a large dog sprinted into the frame and came to a stop in front of the gate. It was huge, at least the size of a car. She leaned forward to get a better look. On closer examination, it wasn't a dog at all. The front legs were much larger and more muscular than the back ones, and it didn't have a snout. The face was shaped more like a bat's than a dog's. Its body was covered in coarse hairs. The creature sniffed at the gate with its flat nose. Seemingly coming to some sort of decision, it smashed into the gate with the full weight of its body, tearing one side of it off the hinges. There wasn't any sound, but she was sure that the metal hitting the ground that hard would have been deafening. The creature lunged through the opening and out of sight. "All of these are showing something different," Josh said as he took a long step back to view the entire wall at once. "And everything is weird." She took a look for herself, and she instantly saw what he meant. Each of the screens was showing something supernatural taking place. Some of them were still images, and others were videos of varying quality. It was a bit overwhelming. On one television, she saw a dark shape swimming just below the surface of a pool. The monitor next to it displayed a picture of three men dressed in suits with pointed teeth and no noses. The third screen showed something that looked very much like Bigfoot resting against a tree. "Wait," she said. "I think those 5 screens up at the top, the ones in the middle, I think they're live." Each of the screens that she was looking at were showing live streams from different places around the Forgotten Tales property. One showed the front yard, with the sheriff's car visible in the driveway. Another showed the backyard. The other 3 were images from the underground facility. The blood drained from her face. One of the screens showed her father and Sheriff Grant in the room with the cages. They were clearly agitated as they talked and pointed in various directions. Every few seconds the image shook, and each time they would look at the door leading into the room. She turned her attention to the monitor showing the room with the hooks. 2 of the well witch's tentacle-like arms were pierced by hooks, and they thrashed wildly as they tried to free themselves. The more they moved around, though, the more tangled they were becoming in the chains hanging from the ceiling. "It must be in the tunnel," she said. "I didn't follow that," Josh replied. "Sorry, talking to myself. These are showing the inside of the underground structure that I told you about. 2 of the well witch's arms are stuck in the hooks, but she's not there. She must be inside the connecting tunnel." He quickly scanned the 3 monitors. "Is there another way out of there?" "Not that I saw. They're in the second room, and beyond that is another short tunnel in the last room. It's a dead end." "We need to do something then. That door isn't going to hold much longer." "I know, but what can we do?" From the far side of the room, standing next to a stack of equipment covered in a sheet, Mira made a half-chirp, half-bark noise to get their attention. Chapter 55. These cages have electrical wires running down into them, Maggie said as she inspected the nearest one. We could pull out the wires and try to electrocute the thing. We can, Michael agreed, having already thought of that particular solution. I doubt it would work, but we can try. The problem is that we have no idea how much voltage these wires are carrying. She sighed. You're worried about hurting Blake. Yeah, there's no way to know how much damage the shock would do to her. Maggie hesitated before saying, we might have to choose between her and us. I know. He ran a hand over his face. I don't know if I can kill a kid to save my own life. And I'm certain that I can't. What if we go through that other door? I know you said it's a dead end, but maybe we can barricade ourselves in. Buy some more time to figure this out. He shook his head. It's a lot more cramped in there. It would only make it easier on her. On one wall was a series of metal shelves with various tools and containers on them. He crossed over to them and started looking for anything that they could use. Most of the containers were partially filled with nuts, bolts, and other building materials, while the rest were empty. The tools were almost all broken, and the ones that weren't were too small to be useful. He had just started to turn away when he noticed a pipe running along the side of the leftmost shelving unit. Someone had painted it black, which made it impossible to see until he was right next to it. It ran up from the floor and into the ceiling. Find anything? Maggie asked. No, he answered, turning towards her. Just a bunch of junk in this pipe. She followed it with her eyes from the ground up to the top of the chamber. Looks like a water pipe. What do you suppose those smaller ones are for? He hadn't noticed the small pieces of piping connecting into the larger one towards the top. There were 6 of them, each one a different color. He hadn't seen a hookup like that before, but his knowledge of plumbing was very limited. Whatever the system was for, it wasn't likely to be of any help to them. The door let out a high-pitched whine as it started to bend out of its frame. He looked over at it just in time to see the top separate from the wall completely, leaving a small gap. 3 fingers wrapped around it slowly. They had maybe another minute at most before the well witch broke through. How many more shells do you have? He asked. 3, Maggie replied tensely, not taking her eyes off the door. If you can hurt those arms enough, maybe we can run past it while it's hurting. You can't seriously think that's going to work. I don't. I just don't have any better ideas. Do you? She grunted. Okay, let's do it. The room was suddenly filled with an extraordinarily loud crackling sound. It was like a burst of static, and Michael instinctively covered his ears. Maggie wasn't able to do so while still keeping her grip on the shotgun, and she visibly winced. Dad? A voice said as the crackling subsided. Dad, can you hear me? Sarah? Michael asked in shock. Yeah, it's me. Thank God. I didn't know if this was going to work or not. He scanned the room until he found what he was looking for. A speaker was mounted in one of the dark corners. Sarah must have found a way to tap into some sort of audio system that both transmitted and received sound. We're in the room that you sent us to, Sarah continued. We can see you guys on the security feed. The well witch is almost through the door. We've noticed, he replied dryly. Sarcasm later. There's a big control panel here, and Josh thinks that it controls some things down there. Lights, sprinkler systems, power, that sort of thing. Is there anything that we can do to help? I don't know what... He jerked his head back towards the pipe. Wait, you can turn on the sprinkler system? Josh thinks he can, yeah. The door started to bend in half from the top down. More of the arms appeared in the gap. The demon would be through any second. There are 6 small pipes leading into the water system here, Michael said, speaking quickly. Can you tell me what they're for? Hold on. He could hear Sarah relaying his question to someone away from the microphone. There was a pause, and for a brief moment the only sound was the door being mangled. Josh says that it looks like some sort of additive system, Sarah said. It mixes things with the water. There's a button for each one, and they're each labeled with a different material. There's gold, chlorine, lead, electrum, salt, and... dish soap? Salt, Maggie exclaimed. Turn on the sprinklers and add salt. No, wait, Michael said quickly. Add electrum instead. But the demons are hurt by salt. The door collapsed all the way in, and the well witch pushed itself into the room. It positioned itself so that it was blocking the doorway and immediately began to advance towards them. The two nearest arms reached out for them. Electrum, Sarah, Michael shouted. Do it! He looked over at Maggie. She was staring at him with fear in her eyes, the shotgun raised towards the demon. He could tell that she didn't understand why he wasn't wanting to use the one thing that had proven to be effective against demons, but he didn't have time to explain it. Trust me, he pleaded. Her expression changed, and she nodded. Turning back to the well witch, she fired a shot into the nearest arm. The creature screeched in pain, but it kept coming. It was so blinded by rage that it was ignoring everything except the desire to rip them apart. Fuck, Sarah yelled over the speaker. It's not working. Dad, I'm sorry, Wait, there it goes. It's mixing. It's going to take a few. Her voice was cut off as one of the well witch's arms lashed out and tore the speaker off the wall. Michael used the momentary distraction to run over to the door leading to the holding cells. He grabbed the wheel and started to turn it. The shotgun fired again, the sound echoing throughout the room. The door unlocked, and he pulled it open. Maggie saw what he was doing and started moving slowly towards him. Firing one more time, she turned on her heel and ran through the doorway. Michael quickly followed her and started to pull the door shut. Two of the well witch's arms whipped through the gap, their fingers grabbing onto the door and pulling it back open. Michael put all of his weight into it, but his feet slid on the ground as he was pulled along with the door. Maggie dropped the now empty shotgun and grabbed the wheel as well. The door stopped moving. Even with their combined effort, they weren't able to get it to start closing, however. They were in a stalemate that they couldn't possibly maintain. Within a few seconds, his legs started screaming at him in exhaustion, and he could see the veins in Maggie's neck bulging as she pulled. The door was already starting to open again. They weren't going to make it. A blast of water struck him in the face. The sprinkler system had begun to spray from hidden sprinkler heads in the ceiling. The well witch howled, and it stopped pulling on the door. Michael wanted nothing more than to collapse, but he forced himself to get back up and return to the cage room. They had to work fast. The well witch was flailing wildly on the ground, the skin of its arms bubbling as the flesh burned. Tissue and blood were flying in every direction, but he ignored it as he searched for the little girl's body. It was near the center of the mass, the arm still stretching out from her mouth. Narrowly avoiding one of the tendrils as it slapped down onto the ground next to him, he grabbed her legs and pulled. Her eyes widened as the creature inside of her realized what he was doing. It didn't seem to have control of its limbs, though, and it wasn't able to defend itself. He pulled as hard as he could. He felt something wrap around his waist, and he turned his head slightly to see Maggie with her arms around him. He nodded, and together they pulled as hard as they could. At first, it didn't seem like the effort was going to be enough. After what seemed like an eternity, the demon started to slide out from inside the girl's mouth. Something hideous was emerging as they pulled, but he looked away and concentrated on the task at hand. Finally, with one last heave, the demon fully emerged and the girl's mouth clamped shut. She moaned and immediately started gasping for air. Maggie picked the girl up and tried to comfort her. How do we kill it? The sheriff asked, purposely keeping her head turned away from the creature writhing on the floor. It's already dead, Michael said, watching as the arms stopped moving. The electrum is seeing to that. What is that stuff? It's an alloy, a mixture of silver, gold, and other naturally occurring metals. It's basically a cocktail of things that hurt paranormal beings. This sprinkler system must have been intended as some kind of fail-safe. He shook his head. My father was a bastard, but luckily for us, he was a paranoid bastard. Sarah, Josh, if you can hear me, great job, you two. Dad, Sarah's voice answered from another speaker in the far corner of the room. When we tried to get the mixture to work, it came up with an error and the whole system completely froze up. Whoever got it to work, it wasn't us. From deeper in the facility, Bingo's laughter filled the air. Chapter 56. Maggie was speaking with Mayor Dilfer on the front steps when Michael arrived at the house. He turned off the car's engine and watched them for a moment. He was tired and sore from recent events, and all that he really wanted to do was go back to Forgotten Tales and continue with the repairs. There hadn't been as much damage as he had feared, just some broken windows, the busted front door, and some dents and cracks on the outside walls and roof. Even so, he wanted to finish up the repairs so that he didn't have to spend another night with cardboard taped over the various openings. There were only a few hours of daylight left, and he still had 3 windows to install. Part of what had taken so long was his admitted lack of skill when it came to home repairs, but mostly it had been due to the other project he had tended to first. While the electrum-laced water had been enough to kill the well witch, the demon's body had still needed to be disposed of. The sheer size of it had made getting rid of it rather difficult. Eventually he had managed to untangle the 2 arms that had been hooked, gathering everything up into a disgusting pile, and had doused the creature's remains in sulfuric acid. It would take some time, but eventually the acid would dissolve the body. He wasn't looking forward to the cleanup process afterward. He sighed and got out of the car. He hadn't heard from Maggie in a few days, and his calls to her had gone to voicemail and remained unanswered. Something had changed when they had been fighting for their lives in the underground facility. Even though she hadn't said anything to him about it, he knew that she had been disturbed by the facility's existence. He had been completely truthful with her when he had said that he had nothing to do with it, but she had looked unconvinced. Showing her the cells afterward hadn't helped either. There was no point in delaying the inevitable. He closed the car door and started up the short concrete path. The mayor nodded as he approached them. Maggie looked at him with an unreadable expression on her face. "Mr. Dyer," Dilfer said, "we've been waiting on you." Michael immediately bristled. He had driven over as soon as he had gotten the call. It had to have been less than 15 minutes between receiving the call and his arrival. "I was washing my hair," he retorted sarcastically. "You don't think that I get these full-bodied curls naturally, do you?" She frowned at him, clearly unamused. He thought that he saw just the faintest hint of a smile at the edges of Maggie's lips, however. "Charming," Dilfer said eventually. "Shall we go inside?" "Actually, Mayor Dilfer, I'd prefer if just Mr. Dyer and myself go in," Maggie said. "This is still an active crime scene." The older woman regarded her for a few moments. Michael was sure that she wanted to object, but for some reason she didn't. She instead nodded once and started walking towards her car. "She's been a pain in my ass all day," Maggie commented as she led him up the steps and to the front door. "What about?" he asked. "Pretty much everything. Mostly about this place. She wants to get someone in to clean it up, but I made her wait until you took a look at it." "Where are we, anyway?" "This," she answered as she opened the front door, "is Morgan Clay's house." They stepped inside and he began to look around. The entire entryway and living room looked like they had been designed specifically for children. The carpet was a rainbow of colors, and the walls had been painted to look like a blue sky with white clouds. Small tables and chairs were pushed neatly to one side, and plastic bins with toys were stacked on the other. A small chalkboard with the words, "Always be happy," written in green chalk was pointing towards the door. "It's upstairs," Maggie said as she led him through the daycare. There was a child safety gate at the bottom of the stairs. She opened it and they went up, each wooden step creaking as weight was put on it. There were pictures on the walls flanking the staircase, each one depicting Morgan Clay smiling with a different child. It would have been heartwarming if he hadn't known that she had traded children's lives for her demonic servants. At the top of the stairs was a small hallway. She led him to one of the doors on the right and motioned for him to look inside. He raised an eyebrow and went through the doorway. He immediately wished that he hadn't. Blood was everywhere. The boards on the walls had been torn away, and the same tissue and muscle that had been growing in the missing children's rooms was hanging out of the holes. The room reeked of death. In the very center of the room was Morgan Clay. She was lying in the middle of an intricate design that had been drawn on the floor. It was circular, and it looked like it had been made with some sort of black sand or ash. He didn't recognize the design. Clay's body had been mutilated. All of her limbs were contorted at strange angles, and she looked somehow flat. It was like every bone in her body had been crushed. There were multiple puncture wounds, most of which would have been fatal. "Did you bring gloves?" Maggie asked. "Yeah," he answered simply, pulling the blue latex gloves out of his pocket and putting them on. "I found a diary in her bedroom. I marked the page with the last entry." She produced a small white book and handed it to him. There was a slip of paper sticking out of the top, and he opened the book to the page that was marked. The script looked like it had been written in a hurry, and there were dark stains on the pages. "I must keep going. There are more sins that must be cleansed before I rest. I must protect it. He warned me the ones I had wouldn't be enough. I don't know how many more I can make. I feel them inside of me now, crawling in my brain and whispering, always whispering. I feel sick. They know." He handed the diary back to Maggie and looked back down at the body. Wishing that he had brought a jumpsuit and shoe covers with him, he carefully stepped around the blood splatter, touching as little of it as possible with his feet. He bent down to get a closer look at the corpse. "She's been dead for at least 36 hours, but it's more likely it's been a few days," he said, probing the body with his fingers. "Probably died the same day she showed up at Forgotten Tales. I have to do a full examination to know for sure. Based on the condition, I'd say that she suffered numerous catastrophic blows across her body. Normally you only see those types of injuries on someone killed in an industrial or construction accident." He picked up one of Clay's hands and examined it closely. Every bone in the fingers is broken. No, not just broken. They've been pulverized. Hold on, there's something under her nails. He took out a small toolkit from his back pocket and opened it. He extracted a pair of tweezers and set the kit down on the floor. Being careful not to break the already splintered nails, he extracted the object that had caught his attention. He retrieved a magnifying glass from his kit and carefully examined it. "It's skin," he said. "It's discolored, but it's definitely skin. And it's rotted." He put the skin into a sample bag. Putting the bag, magnifying glass, and tweezers away, he unzipped a pocket on the inside of the kit lid and took out a ruler. He quickly measured the puncture wounds. Each of them was the same size. He nodded to himself. The measurements confirmed his suspicions. "What are you thinking?" Maggie asked. "These wounds are the same size and shape of the one Mr. Skidder left in Grace Clarendon's skull. There's rotted flesh under her fingernails. I think her demons turned on her and did this." "That was my thought as well. I didn't come at it from the same scientific angle you did, but it's what my gut told me." He stood back up. "We need to check the bedrooms of the 2 children that are still missing," she finished for him. "I did that about an hour ago. The blood and tissue are still there. It's gone from Blake Paulson's room, but not theirs. So they're still out there." "Looks like it. The mayor isn't going to wait any longer, though. She's calling in someone to get everything cleared out of the rooms, as well as get this cleaned up. Johnson, I think his name was." Michael blinked. "Stavros Johnson? He's still alive?" "Yeah, that's him. You know him?" "Since I was a kid. My grandfather used to call him the Cleaner. He specializes in making it look like paranormal events never happened. I'm surprised he's still around. He was old before I was born." She crossed her arms. "The mayor is closing the investigation. She says that she's going to tell the parents that Morgan and Clay killed the children before taking her own life. I can't just let her lie to them like that. They deserve to know what's happening to their kids." Michael was silent. "What?" she demanded. "You think it's right for her to lie to them?" "Honestly," he replied slowly, "I don't know. It's just, is it better for the parents to believe their children died quickly, or is it better for them to be told the truth and find out what their children have become, knowing that they can never be saved? I really don't know the answer to that." Maggie looked down at the floor, her face uncertain. He wished that there was something he could say to her to help her with the awful decision she had to make. He knew that there wasn't. "Who do you think he was?" she asked finally. Clay's diary said that he warned her. Who was she talking about? "Just another unanswered question," Michael said. "There are a lot of them when it comes to Clay. Who is she talking about in her journal? How did she learn how to summon demons in the first place? And what will Mr. Skitter and Skinrod do now that they aren't leashed by a master? It's a long list. I've got another one to add to it, too." "What's that?" "Who killed Morgan Clay?" Maggie tilted her head slightly. "We just agreed that the demons did it." "Yeah, but they were only able to because of this." He pointed down to a small section of the circular design on the floor. It was difficult to see, but a thin portion had been scraped away from the design. "Someone sabotaged her summoning circle," he said. "It's such a small bit of damage that she wouldn't have noticed it unless she was specifically looking for it." "It couldn't have been an accident on her part?" Maggie asked. He shook his head. "There are scratches in the wood. Someone used a tool, probably a knife, to purposely break the circle. As long as the circle was intact, she could command the demons and keep them in servitude. When it was damaged, though, they were free to turn on her." "Do you think it was the same mystery person that hacked into Forgotten Tales' security system and saved our lives?" "There's no way to know, but it would be a hell of a coincidence if it isn't. Wait, what's this?" Michael knelt down and ran his finger over a gouge in the floor. Something was sticking out of it. It took a moment, but he was able to extract the object. "What is it?" Maggie asked, kneeling next to him. "It's a key," he told her in confusion. "The kind of key you get at a motel." The key was attached to a green diamond-shaped keychain. He turned it over in his hand. The words Blackwood Lodge were written in gold lettering on the other side. "What's the Blackwood Lodge?" she asked. "I don't know." He examined the key closely. "Something very strange is going on here, even stranger than we thought." "Fuck." She shook her head. "Just what I need, another damn mystery. How long will you be in town?" "What do you mean?" "Mayor Dilfer forced you into all of this, but before that you had originally planned on being in Lamplight Woods just long enough to settle up your family's affairs. Well, now the killer is dead, and the mayor is closing the case. Does that mean that you're leaving?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Chapter 57. Sarah was waiting for Michael when he returned to Forgotten Tales. The sun was starting to set behind the trees, and for a moment he didn't see her in the shadows being cast on the porch. She waved pleasantly at him as he got out of the car, and he immediately knew that she was up to something. "What did you do?" he asked as she sat down on the stone steps. "Can't a girl just be happy to see her father?" she asked with mock indignation. "Why do I have to have done something?" "The last time you were waiting outside for me when I got home, you had accidentally set a bagel on fire and didn't want me to go inside until the smoke cleared out of the kitchen." "Okay, yes, that may have happened, but in my defense, I still believe to this day it was a defective bagel. This time I'm completely innocent of any wrongdoing, though. I just wanted to talk to you." He sat down the steps next to her. "I suppose that would be acceptable. What do you want to talk about?" Sarah was silent as she gathered her thoughts. Her eyes were slightly narrowed, and she was chewing on her lower lip. She looked so much like her mother had at that age that he felt a familiar sad twinge. "I've been thinking about this for the past few days," she said. "I think that we should stay in Lamplight Woods." He opened his mouth to reply, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, just hear me out, okay? This town has been our family's home for generations. The Dyers have kept Lamplight Woods safe. Without us here, there won't be anyone else to do that. Not from the type of stuff that goes on around here. It's a really important job. I don't think that we should walk away from it." He tried to speak again. She kept going before he could get a word in. "There's also Forgotten Tales. We can't just sell it. There's a lot of dangerous stuff in there, and besides, Great-Grandpa Charles built this place. wouldn't be right for us to just abandon it. A third attempt to talk met the same fate as the first two. And what about Mira? What would happen to it? We can't just take it with us, and who knows what would happen if we just leave it. We can't do that to Mira. He didn't even try to speak this time. Also, you're getting along really well with Sheriff Grant. You're always talking about how you wish that you were able to work in one place instead of driving all over California. You said that Lamplight Woods pays for the Dyer paranormal services, and we could get Forgotten Tales up and running as a legitimate store again. There's also Josh, Michael managed to interject. Yeah, exactly, there's Josh, and he... She trailed off for a second. Okay, yes, it's nice to have someone like him as a friend, but that's not the biggest reason why I think we should stay. Uh-huh, he grinned. A friend. She blushed. Dad, come on, it's not like that. Do you want it to be? Her face turned even more red, and she quickly turned away. Can we just stick to the subject, please? I really think that we should stay. I'm very glad to hear you say that, Michael said, especially since I've already decided that we will be. She turned back towards him. You have? Yep, sure have. So all of this dog and pony show was completely unnecessary, correct? She punched him in the arm. Oh, come on. You could have stopped me at any time. What made you decide to stay? All of the reasons that you just stated, for starters. He leaned back, putting his elbows on the step behind him. I also have this, I don't know, this feeling that it's where we're supposed to be. Maybe your great-grandfather was right with his idea about paranormal entanglement. You lost me there. Do you know what quantum entanglement is? She shook her head. It's pretty complicated, but this is the simplest way that I've ever heard it explained. At its most basic, quantum entanglement has to do with particles that are so connected that they can't even be described separately from one another. Distance doesn't matter. They're always connected. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, although to be fair, he was dismissing the theory when he said that. All right, and paranormal entanglement? Your great-grandfather believed that all paranormal events are linked to one another somehow. More than that, he believed that places like Lamplight Woods are connected to them as well. He used to tell me that Lamplight Woods draws in the paranormal like some giant supernatural magnet. She considered what he had said. How about you? Do you believe that? He shrugged. I don't know. Your mother did. She was right most of the time, too. Maybe we'll find out someday for sure. So we're definitely staying? Sarah asked. We're definitely staying. Epilogue. Sarah left her father sitting on the porch as she went back inside. They had talked for a while after he informed her of his decision, and even though the conversation had been trivial in the grand scheme of things, it had still been nice. It had just been the two of them all of her life, and it was good to know that they hadn't grown apart during everything that had happened. She closed the front door of the house and headed upstairs. Mira appeared on the landing, and it dutifully followed her as she ascended the stairs. When she reached the top, she withdrew a folded piece of paper from the right pocket of her shorts. She had found in the room she and Josh had gone to during the Well Witch's attack on the house. She unfolded the paper and read it for what must have been the 100th time. It was written in her grandfather's now unmistakable handwriting. Unlike the writing in his journal and on the pages she had taken from the trailer, however, this writing was clear and bold with no scribbled notes or drawings on the paper. Evelyn Stone, flesh to form. She carefully folded the paper back up and returned it to her pocket. As she did so, her fingers brushed against the other object she had found in the hidden room. The metal key attached to the red diamond-shaped keyring felt cool against her skin. She looked down at Mira, and it returned her gaze without making a sound. Nodding once, she went over to the hallway closet and opened it. All right, Grandpa, she muttered to herself as she bent down to flip the hidden switch. Time to find out just what it was that you were up to.